Morning.
I said, good morning. That's better.
Look at you guys coming to the 8 o'clock session.
Yeah, the brave. So our session today, your VDI Trifecta, instant clones, app volumes, and user environment manager. All right, standard disclaimer, you've probably all seen this 20 times, so you can read it for yourself. I'm not going to read it to you. What we talk about today, we're going to introduce ourselves and our topic, talk about instant clones, user environment manager, app volumes, wrap things up, and then any questions you have, we'll answer those. So the first thing, for those that maybe aren't familiar with the word trifecta, it's actually a relatively recent addition to the English language. It started out in horse racing where you would pick the top 3 finishers in order. And it's since grown to be any group of 3 typically very desirable things, you know, like curing cancer, ending world hunger, and world peace. So that's what we feel like these 3 technologies represent. Instant clones, app volumes, and UEM represent a trifecta in virtual desktop infrastructure. I'm Rick Watson, and I'm a senior technical instructor with VMware. I've been there a little over 12 years. I started teaching the very first versions of our VDI end-user computing products. Back then it was called Virtual Desktop Manager. And to me, what these 3 technologies represent is the fulfillment of all the promises that we've felt like VDI could achieve for customers. And we're also very fortunate today to have my esteemed colleague, Jim Yannick, with us. And I'm going to pass things over to him.
All right, good morning again. Yes, my name is Jim Yannick. I've been with VMware for just a little over 9 years now, too. I run the application and desktop virtualization side of end-user computing tech marketing. So we do white papers, reference architectures. If you've seen the Horizon multi-site reference architecture, the Horizon Enterprise reference architecture, that comes out of our group. We put together a lot of materials around enablement, technical enablement. So when new products come out, we sort of get to play with them first and put out some of the initial materials around them. I've been, my background, I came from before here, I was at a company called Altiris, some of you may know, PC Lifecycle Management. Before that, I worked for Dell, kind of sort of half work for Dell now. But there I did server and storage. So excited to talk about these topics today. So first of all, who's heard the term jump this week or before? Okay, most of you. And just by a show of hands, how many of you are using today instant clones? Okay, app volumes? A little more. How about user environment manager? Okay, a few less of you on user environment manager. I find that's pretty common. User environment manager is actually one of my favorite products in our portfolio because of the really interesting things it can do for application and profile management. But we're going to talk about this trifecta, these 3 things that really help us deliver a just-in-time desktop that is customized for the user, but also offers a lot of administrative goodness, just in terms of being able to modularly build a desktop experience for users. So instant clones, app volumes, user environment manager are really our subjects today. I'm going to start out with instant clones. I did a session on instant clones the other day with Oswald Chen, one of our engineers who actually is involved in writing instant clones. I'm going to do some of the material from that session, just to kind of introduce instant clones. So a number of you raised your hands and said you've tried instant clones or you're using instant clones. We introduced instant clones last year with Horizon 7. Maybe it was Horizon 6. Graham, was it 6 or 7? 7. It's Horizon 7. Yeah, everything sort of blends together after a while. So it's been out a little over a year now. We've made some real improvements in the technology. Basically, it's a technology that's baked into vSphere. It's a VM fork technology that we leverage to build instant clones. And I'm going to talk you through what we do to build instant clones, what instant clones look like. The big things here is we can create machines very rapidly. There's kind of 2 sides to creating an instant clone. There's a priming process or an image push, and then there's the actual cloning process. The cloning process takes about a second per desktop. No lie, it's about a second per desktop to spin one up. And then we go through a customization process while it's powered on. So 3 to 5 seconds, you have a working desktop. So very rapid technology. So to Rick's point earlier about delivering the promise, we've been sort of talking about linked clones for years as being sort of pseudo just in time, but they take longer. I mean, there's reboots involved. So instant clones actually kind of delivers on that promise. And I'll talk about some of the operational side of this as well. So I said we started this last year. We made instant clones available last year. We've done some improvements this year. So I just want to talk about a couple of the notable additions. One of them is the ability to enable multi-VLAN support within an instant clone pool. So the use case here is I got a pool of 2,000 desktops, and I don't want all 2,000 desktops on a single VLAN. I don't want to have to create, 5 pools. I want to do it all in one pool. This allows us within the UI to enable multi-VLAN support. You'll see in that screenshot there's a networks click box now in the wizard. And if I go in there and when I create the pool, there's a little tick box there. You see there on the other screenshot that by default we'll use the VLAN that the master image is on, or we'll use the network that the master image is on. If I untick that, it opens up a little more of a dialogue, and now I can go and I can select multiple VLANs. So if I want to spread that across 4 different VLANs, I can do that. Now, we've had this ability with link clones for a while, but not in the UI like this is. And we still have the ability with link clones, but you have to use PowerShell and a config file. With instant clones, it's right in the UI. Another thing we've done this year that's pretty notable, we've added 3D support with NVIDIA. So with the NVIDIA M series cards, now I can get a vGPU-backed desktop with instant clones. Right now it's supported on the M series cards. I assume we'll add support for the new P series cards that are coming out. This gives me the ability with instant clone VDI desktop pools to have vGPU in there. Now, we support vGPU with RDSH apps, but not on instant clones yet. That's coming, still a roadmap item. I don't know exactly when we're going to get that out there, but we've got it for VDI. Also notable here, Blast Extreme protocol is what's supported. PC over IP is a tech preview. So Blast Extreme would be the preferred protocol. And in general, Blast Extreme is the preferred protocol. So we also added, when we first did instant clones, it was VDI only. So now we've added support for RDSH hosts. So now I can create an RDSH farm that's instant clones. So instead of having to stamp out link clones or full clones for RDSH, this allows me to very quickly provision a pool of RDSH hosts, expand, contract as necessary. It also offers some pretty cool maintenance options. I can set up a recurring maintenance mode whereby, weekly, monthly, I can recreate those instant clones so that I have sort of, I sort of keep good hygiene in my RDSH pool. And when I do that, I can either, base it on the same image that's already published, or I can publish a new image that maybe has patches or updates. And I can also, during that process, keep a certain number of hosts up so that I have continuous service. One of the really cool use cases for instant clones is I really get to that, or as close as possible to that zero downtime maintenance because of the way this works, and I'm going to show you exactly the way it works so you understand a little more about that. Architecture, pretty simple. If you install the broker, you have instant clones. Horizon 7 and above. I have to, when I install the agent, I need to select either instant clones or linked clones when I install the agent in the desktop. But it's really simple. There's no service like there is with Composer. There's no separate server, and there's no database. We pretty much keep everything in vCenter and a little bit in Atom. Requirements are pretty simple. I'll talk through a couple of things on the bottom here. I've got to have virtual hardware 11, VMXNet, Windows 7 and Windows 10, and of course I probably should have added the server OSs here too. So because of the RDSH. The other big requirement here is I've got to use distributed switches, and I have to use static binding on the port group. with a fixed allocation. If you use ephemeral binding, it's going to fail. There's a little bit of an issue right now. If you happen to have a mismatch of ESX6 and vCenter 6.5, port groups work a little differently, so there's a little bug there where you can't set up instant clone pools. There's a KB on it that explains it. We're working on a fix. It's actually, the fix will actually be out pretty quickly. There's an instant clone domain admin role. I'll just mention this. It's a lot like the domain admin role that we put in place with link clones. It's in a separate spot in the UI, and honestly, it doesn't have to be an admin. It just has to have the rights to the OUs where you're going to put the desktops or servers to create, delete, and write objects. It's documented. So let me talk you through how instant clones work. If you haven't seen these, the first time you kind of go through it, it's like a lot of things are happening in vCenter, and it can be really confusing. I know the first time I looked at it before I read any documentation, I was like, wow, a lot of folders and stuff. So I'm just going to talk you through how this works. So it starts out like a link clone, right? I start with a master VM, you know, what we call the golden image. That's my, you know, my base Windows 10 OS, whatever applications I'm going to put in there, and I take a snapshot of it. So at that point, I'm done with what I'm doing in vCenter, you know, and then I'm going to go on to the Horizon, you know, admin UI or potentially use PowerShell, and I'm going to create a pool. All the rest of the stuff I'm going to talk about is all part of that pool creation process. It's all automatic. You don't have to manually do any of this. So the first object that we're going to create, which is something new for instant clones, is an internal template. That internal template is a linked clone of that you know, snapshot and master image. Really small, but it does add an object in AD. You'll see it in whatever OU you set up in the pool to be the target OU for the desktop, an object called IT000001, for example. That's this internal template. We have it there because it actually helps with our clone prep process to get that machine added to AD. Then we're going to create the replica. Now the replica is, if you're familiar with link clones, is very similar to the replica in link clones. It's a thin provision version of that, you know, of that image, that master VM and that snapshot. So if that's a 60 gig disk and you're using 20 gigs of it, we're going to write out 20 gigs. Now we're going to put a replica on each data store that you're going to put desktops on. So that's my biggest write. That's my read-only replica that the link clone or the instant clones are going to refer back to. The next object is something very new, and this is really kind of the secret sauce or the magic of instant clones. This is a parent VM. So the parent VM is a running VM that's on each host that you're going to put desktops on, and there's one per host per data store. So if I have 4 hosts and 2 data stores, I'm going to have 8 of these, 2 on each host. What it does is it's a running VM. It's going to refer back. It's going to have a delta disk that refers back to that replica. You know, it's kind of like a pre-stage of the actual instant clone itself. So this is running in memory, and at the point that I create my first instant clone, it does some page sharing. Well, I'll talk about the page sharing in a minute when I get to the instant clones. It creates the instant clone, and the way it creates the instant clone is that parent VM is stunned and forked. Again, that's the thing that takes a second, and I've got a new machine. At the point that it's forked, it is completely identical to the parent VM. Its memory state is identical, its delta disk is identical. Once that forking process happens and it goes through the customization, so we use a thing called clone prep, which adds it to AD, activates it, and you know, basically gets it ready to be used. That process taking a couple seconds. Then it's on its own. It has no relation to the parent VM anymore. It's going to start a copy on write operation. So there are some shared memory pages that are in the back. It's not TPS per se, but it's a memory sharing thing that we use to be able to create the instant clone. And its delta disk is going to change. So it's going to become its own unit. So that's kind of the way that this operates. If I look at it in vCenter, and yeah, this is a screenshot from old vCenter client, vSphere client that doesn't exist anymore. But this kind of shows you what things look like in vCenter. Now, I got my master VM, my internal template, my replica, my parent. All of these are in little folders, and they have GUIDs. To be honest, it's a little bit messy right now. Like if you look at this closely, those are all for one desktop image, and you would not necessarily be able to tell that those GUIDs were related to each other. And when you have 10 of those, it becomes really confusing. We're going to clean that up in a future release so that we're going to structure the folders so that it's really clear what relates to what, so which objects relate to what. That really only becomes important when you're in a troubleshooting. If you weren't to my other session on instant clones, check it out on the replays after VMworld. We actually talked a lot about troubleshooting and about a debug mode that you can put these objects into. So, like I said, when we introduced this last year, we had a lot of things we couldn't do. What we really are shooting for and what we're just about at is complete feature parity with linked clones. So if I look at what we can't do today, and this is as of Horizon 7.2, we don't have dedicated desktop pools, we don't have IPv6 support, and we don't have sysprep support. And I'll just call out the sysprep support and say, that's me talking about a corner case. Sysprep really has become something that's not necessarily necessary. It doesn't matter. SIDs don't matter in most things. And when we ship Horizon 7.3 in a few weeks, we'll have dedicated desktop pools and we'll have IPv6 support. So we're really, as I said, we're really closing the gap there. So this is one of those things, if you haven't looked at instant clones yet, I encourage you to do so. The technology is really good. Like I said, we've had it out for now for a little over a year. We've got a lot of customers with it in production. There's a lot of operational goodness you can get from using instant clones, and it's really the building block for this jump story or this trifecta that we're going to talk about. And I'm going to turn it over to Rick.
Thank you, Jim. So, if you're using remote desktop services sessions or instant clones, then you're going to have a non-persistent desktop. And things that the user does, like changing their background or setting their fonts, and all those things could potentially be lost when that user disconnects from their session. And we all know users don't like that. So that's where User Environment Manager comes in. Now, we felt like our audience was probably fairly familiar with what a VM was, so we didn't go too far back in explaining the background and what's going on with that. But we're going to do that with User Environment Manager and app volumes because probably some of you maybe haven't even heard those terms before or don't know what goes on. All right. So first thing, just defining User Environment Manager. Windows instance has applications that are installed, has settings, all really tightly integrated with that instance of Windows. Well, what User Environment Manager does is it lets you capture all that data and save it and preserve it and then apply it to another instance of Windows for that particular user. So the user perception is they're connecting to the same copy of Windows over and over, day after day, even though that copy of Windows they're using in an instant clone may have only existed for a few seconds. All right? So it captures things like all their personalization settings, all the configuration they make to applications to make the app run the way they want it to run, and various user environment settings so that, like I said, they think they're logging on to the same copy of Windows over and over. Okay? Now the way this works is on the endpoint systems you install a UEM client or agent. And another thing about UEM, it doesn't care how that Windows got there. It can be running on an instant clone VM. It could be running on a physical computer. It could be a remote desktop services session. It could be some other virtualization, which I don't know why you'd be doing that, but theoretically, it would still work if you just wanted to prove it to yourself. Now, that client talks to two shares. Okay? The first share is a configuration share, and it just reads data from that share. And then each individual client writes to a share for the specific user that's logged onto that system. And that share is created automatically. That folder is created automatically for the user. So this is how, when they go from one system to another that has the UEM agent on it, their settings follow them around. Okay. Now, to get that set up, there's a little bit more that goes on. We've talked about the two shares. There's also a application that's called the UEM Management Console. And this is how you define what information you want saved. You can also do things like define settings that are mandatory. So let's say, for example, you want to enforce that they have a password protected screensaver. Well, you can make that setting with UEM and they're not allowed to change it. So in a way, UEM gives you the benefits of both Windows roaming profiles and Windows mandatory profiles. And before, I saw some people shudder when I said those words. This is not that mechanism. This is a totally different mechanism. It's what those things should have been, you know, all along. All right. So with that management console, you configure the system, and then there's a couple of ways you can tell the clients where that configuration is. Up until, I believe, about version 9.1 of UEM, you used a group policy setting to push that configuration down to the clients. What the clients would do is that would tell them where to read their configuration. Now, in version UEM 9.1, 9.2, the newer versions, we can bypass that Active Directory GPO requirement, and we can have the client, we can inform it where that share is, and it doesn't have to talk to Active Directory. So if you have a scenario where you're either not using Active Directory, or maybe the Active Directory administrators are a little hesitant to let you play around with their GPOs, you can still implement UEM. But now that those clients, those UEM clients know where their configuration share is, it tells them also where the user share is, and then a unique folder is created for each one of those users, and their settings are stored there. Then anytime after their first login with the UEM client, their settings are retrieved from that folder. Now, something you might not have noticed, there's no UEM server. So the infrastructure for this is 2 shares. So it's a very low overhead infrastructure. There's no database. So those are the only extra things you need. And it also helps this to scale. I mean, very easily scales to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Also, you don't have to point every user to the same configuration. You can have different configurations for different divisions within your organization, different departments, different groups, theoretically even different individuals, although you probably don't take it that far typically. All right. Now, on that user share, what is created is a series of small files. And there's a file, for example, for each application. So each one of these icons on the screen represents a separate file for that application. And the settings for that specific application are stored in that file on the share. This is a pretty long list in this interface here, so what you can't see that's further down is Windows settings. So not only is it application settings, but it's also Windows settings, user environment settings. And so in addition to saving what the end user does, you can pre-build configuration here and have a default configuration that gets pulled down, for example, the first time they launch Microsoft Excel, or the first time they launch Notepad++ or VLC. You can also make those configurations mandatory. So you can have, like I mentioned, the specific things mandatory. Those settings the user isn't allowed to change, but any other setting that you don't define as mandatory, can be changed by the user. All right. For the applications, the settings aren't pulled down to the system with the UEM agent until the user launches that application. So unlike traditional, Windows roaming profiles where you had to pull the whole profile down, you only pull down a small set of information initially, and then as specific applications are launched, you pull down their settings. And also, as you'll see in a moment, when the user exits that application, its settings are saved. So you don't have to wait to log off to copy a bunch of data. Okay. I mentioned the predefined settings that you can create that can also be, they can be predefined, but the user can change them, or you can make them predefined and mandatory. Okay. And something that's incredibly helpful for you, it gives you a lot more time to go play Warcraft, is there's a help desk tool, and you can delegate to your help desk the ability to support end users. These settings, you can define how many backups you want to keep. You can keep backups for several days, and the help desk can roll that user's settings back to a previous day, or they can reset it to the default. So if you have a user that misconfigures an application and is not able to get it to function correctly, the help desk can roll it back to the way it was yesterday or the day before, and the user can be on their way and be productive again. All right, so as I mentioned, when the system starts up and the user logs on, if that user has never logged on to UEM before, we need to pull down a base profile. If the user's logged on before, we pull down specific settings that that user has saved. And those are primarily Windows settings, okay? The way they want their background and those sorts of things. Then at an application launch, the settings for that application are pulled down. And that's done with a mechanism with a UEM that's referred to as DirectFlex. And the user uses that application, and then when they exit that application, settings for that application are written back to that specific user's folder. And then at log off, any unsaved settings, which is going to be a small set, are written to the user's what we call profile archive share. Right? Right. Now, another thing that makes UEM incredibly powerful is you can evaluate the specific conditions of the system running the UEM client or agent. And based on those conditions, you can apply or not apply various kinds of settings, such as Horizon Smart policies. So as we'll see in a moment here, those Horizon settings that you're currently limited to doing by pool or globally or individual user, you can now add some more sophisticated evaluation of the client and more sophisticated logic. So for example, you can look at the conditions of the UEM client, its IP address, its Windows version, the day of the week, what group is the user in, and many more. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. You can also combine those conditions into logical combinations. For example, you can see this one saying if the IP address is in this particular range and the operating system is Windows 7, and the user that's logged on is a member of this particular group. So it evaluates those conditions top down. In the case here where we're using an and, unless all of them are met, it will not apply this. So if you were, saying, for example, you wanted to allow the USB redirection function of Horizon, you could limit it based on these kinds of things. But we're not limited to doing ands. There are or statements, and we can not the and the or. So you can do very sophisticated analysis of the condition of that UEM client to filter out exactly what you wanted. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, you can apply these conditions to Horizon policies like USB redirection, the clipboard, client drive redirection, HTML file transfer, and give you much more granular control over when those are applied. So for example, you could allow client drive redirection when the UEM agent was connected to the corporate LAN, but block it when they were off at home or on the road. Okay. Speaking of that, there's a feature in UEM called application blocking, and what you do after you enable it globally, you can define applications that would be blocked. So maybe there's some games or things like that you don't want people playing. You can do that, but it's more sophisticated than that because you can also allow applications as well. Right? So you define. You enable it, you define the conditions, you define the application you want to block, And you can do it as easily as just browsing to the path of the executable. Then if the user tries to launch that application, they get an error message, and it's also, as you can see at the bottom right there, logged. And you can use a tool, for example, like vRealize Login Site, to look for that and document and monitor what's going on. Right? Another feature of User Environment Manager is privilege elevation. Right? Typically, if you're doing a Windows, instant clone or RDSH session, the user has very limited Windows permissions. And if you're using certain kinds of applications, they won't run unless the user has some fairly high administrative level permissions. So for privilege boy, that word is killing me today. Elevation. I want to say escalation, that's why it keeps tripping me up. But you can do that for running the application. So for an old application that requires higher administrative level permissions, you can do that. You can also do it for installing an application. So you can allow users to install applications even if their Windows permissions would say they can't, but you can build this and limit it to the applications you want them. So you can build a repository and allow users to install applications from that repository, but not from just anywhere in any application. So as you can see, User Environment Manager, it gives you something that is going to make your end users happy. It gives them that persistence. Even though the copy of Windows they're using may be an instant clone that only existed 5 seconds ago, it may be a remote desktop services session that they connected to and they were doing a totally different one yesterday, they're going to perceive that they're connecting to the same Windows over and over. They're going to have their settings just the way they want it, which is going to help them be much more productive and much less frustrated from having to reset their favorite settings over and over every day. All right? So if you're using instant clones, RDSH hosts, you want to keep, especially those instant clone VMs, as light and as small as possible, and you don't want to have to keep installing applications on them. So this is where app volumes comes in. App volumes gives you a way to deploy end user applications to any copy of Windows, like an instant clone VM, link clone VMs, any kind of VM or RDSH VM, without having to actually install that application specifically on that system. All right, so traditionally, this is almost deja vu for the User Environment Manager, but traditionally, applications and their settings very tightly integrated with Windows. Okay. So what User Environment Manager, now I'm really getting off track. What App Volumes does, App Volumes, it puts a layer of abstraction between Windows and the applications, and just like what you see happen, with a virtual machine, where ESXi puts a layer of abstraction between the hardware and the operating system. This is on the other side of the operating system. We're putting a layer of abstraction between the operating system and the applications. And that lets us add and remove those applications, whenever we want to, on the fly. Okay? So the way it works, your VM has a C disk, and we connect additional disks to that virtual machine. The App Volumes agent provides access to those additional disks. We call them app stacks. And those app stacks contain one or more applications you want to provide to that end user. Okay? So if you look at it a little more closely, you got the agent, which is tied into the Windows OS VMDK, to the app stack VMDK. That app stack VMDK has the applications on it, but as far as Windows is concerned and the user is concerned, that's all one happy C drive, and it seamlessly integrates those applications with the operating system. Okay. So if you're going to deploy applications in an app stack, How do you get them there? Well, in the App Volumes Manager utility, you create a brand new app stack, which is essentially a blank VMDK file. The App Volumes Manager asks you to point it to a virtual machine that has the App Volumes agent on it. It connects that VM to that new blank disk, and then you install the applications just like you normally would. Okay? Once that's done, in the App Volumes Manager, you say this app stack is ready to deploy, and the App Volumes Manager disconnects it from that VM, and now you can deploy it to whatever users in your organization. You can deploy it based on AD groups. You can deploy it based on organizational units. As one of my coworkers said, and with apologies to Chester Cheetah if he's here, this is dangerously easy. You know. All right? It's too early in the morning. You guys need some coffee or something, you know?
It's
okay.
First session.
Yeah, or better jokes, right? All right, so how does this all fit together? Well, on the left, you have the user's endpoint VM with the App Volumes agent. When they log on, it talks to an App Volumes Manager server. That App Volumes Manager server has a database that it refers to define what app stack disks it should connect to that system. It also talks to Active Directory to find out what groups and OUs that user account is in, to figure out if there's any assignments based on that. Then it talks to vCenter and says, hey, vCenter, connect these particular virtual disks, these app stacks, to that endpoint system, and now the user's up and running. And this happens in a fraction of a second while other processes are going on at user logon. So once the user's logged on, they click on the icon for that app or double click on a file, and the app launches and they're running the application. Okay? So that's the process of getting things deployed. Sooner or later, you're going to need to patch or update applications. And a particular user, whether they're on a remote desktop session or, for example, an instant clone or other kind of, Verizon. Man, today is Horizon.
I've done that before.
Yeah. That particular system might connect to multiple app stack disks to get different kinds, of applications. But let's say you need to update or patch one of those. So you go back to the provisioning process, go back to the app stack, you update that app stack, and then you can replace that original app stack with your new app stack. You can even specify whether that should happen immediately or the next time the user logs on. So if you specify immediately and the user isn't running that application, if they launch that application, they'll get the new version. Worst case scenario, they have to log off and log back on to get to the new version of that application. Okay. Now, which we talked about with instant clones, they go away when the user logs off. These app stack disks are read-only. So one potential here is if the user were to save files onto their instant clone C drive, they're gone at log off. Well, App Volumes gives you a solution for that called a writable volume. And it's just a VMDK file. If you're familiar with the composer link clone mechanism of persistent disk, it's very similar to that. Okay? But again, the App Volumes agent makes this look like one big happy file system. So the user doesn't have to worry about, oh, where do I save those files? You've defined that you want files to be saved to that writable volume. Now, in addition to saving files on that writable volume, the user can potentially install applications. So with something like User Environment Manager, you could have allowed them to install applications there. Okay? Also, you can define that the user profile gets directed to that writable volume. Now, if you're using User Environment Manager, that's a better solution, in that scenario. But it does give you a potential solution, especially if you don't use User Environment Manager in your particular environment. One other thing, the app volumes, app stacks, you typically want to install several applications on there. You can use user environment managers application blocking if you need to prevent specific users from accessing a certain application. So it gives you more flexibility. So just as we've seen how user environment manager and instant clones work together to complement each other, the same thing happens with user environment manager and app volumes. So with that, if you want to learn more about these things, there are VMware courses that cover these technologies. There's also down in the whatever floor that's on, down in the VM Village, there's an education and certification lounge you can come by and visit. And to conclude things, I'm going to pass it back over to my esteemed colleague, Jim.
We've also got some hands-on labs, both for instant clones, for app volumes, for user environment manager. So if you haven't been down to the HOL, there's some decent labs down there. So we want to leave plenty of time for questions. So I'm just going to kind of do a quick wrap and bring this sort of all back together. So we've been talking about, the jump technologies. Now, if you went to the keynote this week, the EUC keynote on Monday afternoon, we gave a little preview of somewhere we're going with jump. Now, up to now, jump has really been, a construct of instant clones, app volumes, and user environment manager. You use each individual console to kind of configure that. What we're doing with this is we're putting together a workflow around this so that I can go and say, here's what I want this user's environment to look. This is the kind of desktop I want them to have. These are the applications I want them to get. And here's all the policies I want to apply. Be able to do that right in the Horizon console and have all of that stuff orchestrate underneath. But for now, we'll kind of talk about what this is. So this is kind of a picture of the Horizon environment. You'll recognize connection servers and unified access gateway for external access, RDSH farms, and VDI desktops that we've created with instant clones, right? So that's the starting point. Now, I'm talking about Horizon 7 here, the classic VDI platform that we've had for, well, since I've been at VMware for about 10 years now. But this also applies to a Horizon Cloud, our hosted and our on-prem. I can create these desktops and these hosts, and I can attach app stacks to them, right? So I can add applications, both core applications that every user is going to get, and then departmental applications. So I can construct on the fly an application environment. Now, you're going to probably put some applications right on the base image, particularly if you're using instant clones, because it's very easy to update them. And there are some things that just everybody uses, right? Everybody needs an Adobe Reader, everybody's using Office, so I'm probably just going to put those there. But other applications, I would use app volumes to create. And then I can control all of this with policy, right? So for user environment managers, so I have a lot of power here. I can, because of those conditional accesses or conditional things that Rick talked about, I can say, if you're in the office, it's okay to use USB redirection. It's okay to use client drive redirection. I'm going to map you to printers. But if you disconnect and you go pick up your kids and then later you're going to do some work from home and you reconnect through Universal Access Gateway, I'm going to reevaluate that and say, all right, you're on an external network now, so I'm not that comfortable from a security standpoint with you having client drive redirection. You don't need access to that printer that's in the office because you're not going to print there. Maybe you're going to print at home, so maybe I'll let you turn on the thin print capability and print to your printer at home. But I can change things on the fly, which is really the power of this. So bringing this all together in one stack allows me to construct a really good workspace. Now, again, going back to Rick's initial comment about kind of delivering on the thing we've been talking about for a long time. I've been doing this for a little over 9 years, and we've been sort of talking about, we want to be able to construct the desktop on the fly, make it pretty stateless, turn the C drive into a sort of a disposable commodity. I really believe these technologies coming together really is bringing us that now. So, I mean, we're at that point. Took a little while to get there, but honestly, I really feel we're at that point. So if you haven't explored some of these technologies and you're doing VDI or you're doing remote applications, really worth taking a look at this. So we're going to open it up for questions. I'll just, before Q&A, a couple things. There's mics on each side. And I'm just going to tell you, get right up in that mic, because if you kind of stand back, you're going to sound like you're cutting out on a bad cell phone call. And then just kind of a plug for the survey at the end. Please go and do the survey. If you like the session, let us know. If you didn't like it, just kind of keep that to yourself.
Thank you for attending and for your patience.
Yeah,
and we hope you have a great
8 o'clock session.
Party tonight. My daughter tells me that it's really cool that we have Blink 182 here.
Go ahead.
Morning. So I have a couple questions, if that's okay.
Closer to the mic.
Okay, better?
That's great.
All right, so one of the applications that hasn't been discussed, which works, I think, in conjunction with UEM, is the application profiler, which obviously configures it when you run it, all the registry keys and all of the files needed for user environment capture.
Yep.
Unfortunately, that application profiler does not work with UEM's pre-installed configuration, like say Word and whatever. You know, they'll say there's a configuration file that already exists. It can't do it, and you can't delete the ones that are already there. I guess my question is, what is the best way to know what registry keys and/or file keys you need to put into the UEM config file to capture all information we need to capture for the user?
So the application profiler is the best way to do it. Now, there's some other tools you could use, and if you want, we can chat a little more offline, because there's some other tools. We actually have a blog series out about using the application profiler. So what we find in general is, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 70% of applications as you profile, it just grabs everything. But there are some corner cases. So this blog series I mentioned that's on our EUC blog, we deal with a couple of those corner cases. Like, for example, one of the ones we analyzed was VLC, because VLC is kind of a weird cat in that it puts some stuff in registry keys, but it also uses an INI file, and we wouldn't necessarily capture the INI file. There are ways to get to it. So honestly, the application profiler is the tool for doing this. And again, if you've got specific issues, we can talk offline after the session.
One more question, if I might. So what's the main difference with writable volumes with respect to that profile capture and UEM?
So great question. So writable volumes would not be the preferred method to capture profile, and here's why. Writable volumes, it captures the entire profile, right? It's really just grabbing the profile and dumping it into what amounts to a big dumb disk that you don't have much introspection into. So it's really no different than a roaming profile or even a local profile. User Environment Manager is, most people think of it as, it's just a profile management tool. It really isn't. I mean, we manage user environment, so we manage all the Windows user environment, and then we manage applications. But I have to whitelist applications to manage them, right? So I have to go through the application profiling process and add those in there and say I want to manage these settings. We don't capture everything in one big giant pile and then have the issues that you have with profile corruption. We capture it in pieces. So I guess those are the two big things. Now, the other thing that you would couple User Environment Manager to kind of get the whole picture is folder redirection. So folder redirection and User Environment Manager would be, from our standpoint, the preferred method for dealing with the user profile.
This side, over here?
Yeah, two questions. One is, are we ever looking into one console for all these three products?
Yes. That's about all I got for you on that.
Okay, figured.
I was hoping you had more, because the yes was all I had.
So I mentioned this sort of concept of this jump workflow. That'll be sort of the first throw at that. So in later this year into next year, we're going to release that as part of the Horizon console. There's going to be a relaunch of the Horizon console. We're going to get away from the Flash and move to HTML5. So we'll start to see some of that come together. So yes, absolutely. I want it as badly as you want it. I just can't tell you when.
You have a second?
And yes, second question is actually pretty quickly. You said GPO is not really required for UEM anymore. How do we tell the clients where to look?
There's a no AD mode. So you basically, when you launch the agent, you're telling it where to go to get the config file for the no AD mode. Now I will say, not the preferred method to do it. If you have access to AD, that's the preferred method to configure it. We have no AD mode mostly because there are customers who they can't get to AD. Like for example, I was working with a defense contractor and they have 3 people worldwide who can make changes to AD. That's it.
So if we do have AD, that's still your recommendation. But are you moving away from it?
No,
Okay.
Not at all.
Thank you.
My question is basically, what's the difference with UEM versus persona management?
UEM's what you should be using. Persona manager you shouldn't be using.
So there you go. That's it.
All right.
Yeah.
It's the new and improved is UEM.
So it's a replacement. Basically.
Yeah, View Persona still exists, but there's absolutely no development going on it. It's basically a dead stick at this point. I mean, if you're using it, you can continue to use it, but that's, really you want to migrate the user environment manager.
Support for Persona is going away.
Yeah.
Right. On this side?
One of my engineers texted me to ask you, where are the log files associated with instant clones?
They are on the connection server. So if you go to the replays after VMworld, we actually have a slide on it in the session that I did on instant clones. So it was myself and Oswald Chen, but they're on the connection server.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right. On this side?
Oh, you got to get in that mic.
Yeah.
I've got a few of them. When will UEM support C program data?
Be able to support what?
C program data.
Support how?
The importing and exporting of C program data.
With UEM?
With UEM. Because a lot of applications write users' settings and stuff to program data.
As far as I know, we can do that now if you want to go in there and add it.
Yeah, I haven't been able to do it. Is it the newest version does it?
Yeah, as far as I know,
Yeah, as far as
UEM,
I know, you can.
If you look, is it in the import, in the import-export tab? Is there a statement for that folder?
Well, you can add it.
Not on my version.
Yeah, you can add it.
Yeah, add it.
Will there ever be support for Mac OS X?
For UEM? I don't think so.
When you update an app stack immediately instead of at next login, what does the user actually see if they're in?
Yeah, don't do that.
Okay.
Because basically you're gonna leave your user without their application and they're gonna blue screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's the name of the blog you were mentioning just a minute?
Name of what?
The blog that you were mentioning just a minute ago.
So if you just search for, let me think, User Environment Manager Application Profiling, there's like 4 blogs.
It's the EUC blog, right?
It's on the VMware EUC blog, though, on the official VMware EUC blog.
Right over here?
Like many other customers and companies, we made a large investment in the PCORP hardware, and it seems like development is more towards Blast Extreme now, and I saw PCORP, you said, is coming in a tech preview for InstaClones. Do you have a timeline on that?
So that was specifically for vGPU. I don't know where we're going to go with that. I mean, just being honest, Blast Extreme is what we're developing. I mean, PC over IP, we're going to continue to maintain it. We understand people have got thin clients. If you zero clients, enable Blast Extreme for the pool, and we detect that it's a zero client or a pre-Horizon 4 client, we'll automatically connect on PC over IP. But I mean, we're moving towards Blast Extreme.
Is there any known zero clients that support Blast?
About 100 of them, or maybe 200.
Or are
now.
they thin clients?
Yeah, they're all thin clients.
Thin clients.
I mean, it's the new definition of zero client. Yes. I mean, and I would argue a zero client isn't really a zero client anyway because there's an OS on it. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
On this side?
On the instant clones, do you have any recommendations on how to deal with OneDrive and antivirus definitions?
Long conversation. So I don't have anything right off the cuff here, but we can talk offline.
All right, over here.
Yeah, instant clone support for server 16 and server 12R2 as a desktop.
Coming at some point. Although, okay, to be honest, the server as a desktop was supported because of the Microsoft licensing thing with service providers, which they just changed. So whether that is going to be a thing or not, I don't know. So
just changed? We can do the Windows desktop OS as a service
shared
provider?
hardware. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, Microsoft just made a change to that.
When did that change?
It was like a few weeks ago.
Oh, wow. Okay, thank you.
Everyone understand?
What was it? September 7th, I guess.
You have a question?
Yeah. I have a number of instant clone pools and lots of data stores and hosts. So in vCenter, I get about 100 warnings on my parent VMs.
Yep.
Is that normal?
Yeah,
I know
it
that,
is.
Is that going to go away?
Completely normal, completely annoying. I think they're working with the core vSphere team to do something to fix that. But yes, that's normal because when we bring those parents up, we just balloon the memory. So you get the default I think is 85%, so it just warns.
Yeah, it just gets in the way of the rest of my warnings.
When I first did an instant clone deck, I had a whole section of things that I called things that look like a problem but really aren't, and that was one of them.
Thank you.
Yep.
Over here.
I have two questions. First on if we're using Persona, do you have a tool that will convert to the UEM?
Yeah, you basically just turn UEM on and start capturing settings.
And can use the same server or same
they're file
folders?
shares. So yeah, there's actually a blog. We've got a blog that's been out for a while on that. Pim Fontefis, who was on our team, wrote that. I don't know the exact title of the blog, but we do have a sort of quick way of doing that. But basically, you just turn on UEM and have it start collecting the settings.
Yeah, in the EUC
you have to
blog.
keep two for a little while.
What's that? Yeah,
you have to
exactly.
keep two for a little while.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
And second question for app volumes, we started to use virtualized applications a long time ago, and the big issue we ran into is individual licenses. How do you handle those? Would those need to be put into each individual's personal settings to allow that license? If you don't have an enterprise license for, say, a Photoshop, only a few people use it?
Yeah, I guess it's going to depend on where that license needs to be entered and how that works, because potentially you could capture that in the profile somewhere on the writable volume potentially, but it's going to be sort of a one-off for each one depending on how they're managing that.
Yeah, that was our biggest roadblock, too many snowflakes. So.
The UEM application blocking and allowing?
Well, it would, yeah, but there's still, if there's still an individual license that they, you have to put to be compliant, it's still a little trickier. But yeah, I mean, you could make the application available to everybody and just block it for everybody except the people who have the group. But if you actually have to put in a physical license key, that's still a little trickier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, over here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask anyway. Is there any intention to support the old NVIDIA K cards with instant clones?
I doubt it. There's and I got this question in the other session too. I know a lot of people have K cards. I don't know. It depends on how much demand there is from the customer side, and some of it is us working with NVIDIA on it. So they tend to be more motivated to support the newer cards.
Thank you.
Yep. So you probably did know the answer to that, right? Yeah. Over here.
I keep hearing vGPU support with instant clones. Will the software 3D graphics also, is that also supported?
It's on the roadmap. It isn't right now. But
Okay.
the soft 3D is on the roadmap.
Kiosk workstations.
Yeah.
Another question, does the IC replica get copied to every host in a vSAN cluster?
It only gets copied to the data store, so it's going to get copied to the data store and then get replicated based on the FTT settings in the vSAN. So only once on the vSAN.
And then is there a timeline for App Volumes 4?
Sometime after App Volumes 3 something. Yeah, no, not right now.
Over here.
So for a remote site or for a replicated site, is there a way to replicate the user and data shares for a UEM?
Yeah, actually, we actually have a Horizon Enterprise multi-site reference architecture that talks about just that. So basically, the simplest way to do it is to use DFSR and DFSN. And we go into detail in that document. So Horizon 7 Enterprise multi-site reference architecture, and Graham Gordon sitting here in the front row is the guy who spearheaded writing that. So.
And can you give me some insight to the memory and CPU usage of those parent clones that reside on each host?
What about the
memory and CPU usage as they sit?
They're gonna use whatever memory and CPU that they're configured for. So it's basically going to take up a desktop slot, so to speak. Now what they don't do is if you happen to use if you happen to have them configured for GPU, they won't use a GPU slot. They'll have that configuration, and the instant clones that get configured off of them will use the slots, but they won't.
Okay, so it sounds like we're multiplying the number of data stores. So let's say I have 3 data stores.
Yep.
And I have 10 templates currently. I think what you're saying is using AppVols, we're probably going to consolidate the amount of templates. So you're not expecting me to have 30 parent VMs on each host,
yeah,
right?
in fact, what we really want you to get towards is consolidating down to as few templates as possible. If you can get down to 1, and we have some customers who have, that is the ideal scenario. And keep in mind, the parent VMs and all the other objects are, oh, we're out of time too, they're going to kick us out of here. So all those objects are going to get reused if I'm using the same image for different pools. So if I have 5 pools that are based on the same image, I'm only going to have 1 set of parents and replicas for those 5 pools.
Thank you.
Yep. One more, and then we got to get out of here. We can talk it off, in the hall.
In App Volumes 3.0, there's a cool feature with file shares where you can put app stacks up on a file share and it'd be consumed into multiple data centers.
Yep.
Is that feature coming in the two?
So at some point, and I don't know when, there's going to be a come together between those 2 code streams, and then we'll start to see more of that. Yep.
So down the road.
Down the road. Yep. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Hey, you guys were great with questions. Appreciate that.